All right. Good evening. Welcome to the Baltimore History Evening, our May installment. I am very excited about our guest this evening, somebody I've known for a while and I know has been doing really great work on this topic for a while. But just before that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping here. So you'll notice that as you're coming into the Zoom, you are muted. We would ask that during the course of the presentation, if everybody could stay muted, but we would love to see if you have comments or questions. You feel free to drop those into the chat and we will make sure to address them toward the end of our hour. So I am here representing the Baltimore City Historical Society Board, and I'm sure several of my colleagues will be here as well. But we are an all-volunteer operation supporting the scholarship and sharing of Baltimore City history that everybody here knows and loves. So I ask you to just consider that with such free programming as this, as well as our various history honors, our outreach with students, please support the Baltimore City Historical Society. Consider becoming a member and finding other ways to join and collaborate with us. I also want to give a very big thank you to Trace Architects for sponsoring the Baltimore History Evening series again this year. So many thanks to that support, as well as to our membership, our board, and other collaborators. But with all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Amy Rosenkrans, who is a historian, middle school social studies teacher in Baltimore, who has a wide range of research interests. But what we're going to be hearing about this evening, excuse me, is the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange. And although there are generations of Baltimoreans who have fond memories of this institution, no comprehensive history of the institution exists. The Maryland Women's Heritage Center and Dr. Amy Rosenkrans are seeking to rectify that omission. And we'll present this history of the exchange and a status report of the overall project, Memories of the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange. She will also provide participants with information on how to share their own memories of the institution. And again, for those of you that maybe have been with us before or just coming into the Zoom, we encourage participation through the chat, and we'll address those at the end. And I know Dr. Rosenkrantz will appreciate any research leads, suggestions, or folks that maybe want to help out with this project. So with all of that said, I want to thank and welcome Dr. Amy Rosenkrans.
Thanks, David. I'm really excited to be here tonight. And as David said, this is going to be a fully participatory discussion. We at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center are very excited to be in our new home. The Maryland Women's Heritage Center is an organization that recognizes, documents, and celebrates the contribution of Maryland women. And it's our goal to add her story to history to tell our story. And a couple of years ago, during the height of the pandemic, we were able to move into our brand new home at 333 North Charles Street, which is the old Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange. One of the things that was super exciting about moving into this historic building was to be able to continue the legacy of the women helping women that has been happening in Baltimore for well over a century. Once we moved into the exchange, our executive director, Diana Bailey, reached out to me as a new member of the executive board, and we were talking, and I had been helping with our suffrage centennial research project. And she told me that there was a room of stuff at the Women's Industrial Exchange building that was all sorts of history stuff that was just sitting there. and that she thought it would be an excellent opportunity for a new research project after the Women's Suffrage Centennial Project. And as many of you would be like me, you're like, oh my gosh, let me in there. So I got in there and I discovered an entire room full of boxes of historical artifacts of the Women's Industrial Exchange. That sparked the next project, or the project that we're currently doing now, which is the Memories of the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange. And it's our goal to create a comprehensive history of this icon. So as I talk, please take notes, put notes in the chat, because we're looking for more information. Something that tragically happened early on, mid-century, was an incredible flood to the building that destroyed a number of the records. So we're trying to piece together the history of the exchange. So when we talk about Baltimore history, we all know that Baltimore has a very complicated history, in many different reasons. But this history that we're talking about today with the Women's Industrial Exchange goes all the way back to the Civil War. And we know that Baltimore's history, as I mentioned, is complicated. There were people that were on both sides of the Civil War, and there were many people who were very, very much dedicated to the Confederacy. During the war, as we see here with probably one of the most famous Harper's Weekly, at least as far as Baltimore history goes, we have women and men that were outwardly relating their sympathies. But we also know that we have lots of different fundraising fairs going on in Baltimore for both sides. There is the Baltimore Sanitary Fair in 1864, which raises money for the Union, which raised approximately $83,000. In today's money, that would be about $2.8 million. But just a couple of years later, we have an organization starting called the Ladies Southern Relief Association of Maryland, headed by many of the creme de la creme ladies of Baltimore City. I know it's hard to see, but if you look here, you can see a number of different names that we still see on streets, on buildings, and throughout our Baltimore history. And these women were supporting the women and families in the South, and they had a fair in 1866, which raised approximately, let's see, $148,000 in 1866 money. So when we talk about, we look through the histories and we look through the Baltimore Sun and other articles, the money that was raised by the Southern Relief Fair was significantly more than that was raised for the Union effort. The women that led this effort, the same names keep popping up. And those women's, those same names will create and found something known as the Ladies Depository. This was formed as a way to help women who had become destitute due to the war and the after effects of the war. This was formed to help women who needed to support their families and who it was not appropriate for them to go out to work. So they formed this Ladies Depository where women could sell their fine needlework, they could sell their home-baked goods, they might even sell some of their family heirlooms to make ends meet. And the women that will lead that effort, again, will be people like the Howards, the Giddings, the McKims. And it's their idea to help not only the Southern women in Baltimore, but also women throughout different parts of the South. We're then going to see by 1873 another organization forming in Baltimore, again by some of the same women, and one name is going to start popping out quite frequently, the Ladies Relief Association. This association was to give direct relief to needy families in Baltimore City. And what's interesting, and this is something new that's popped up in our research, is that this was for the deserving poor, but also for those without regard to creed, nationality, or color. And this originally basically set up 4 soup kitchens across Baltimore City for the winter of 1873. And the woman who becomes the president of this organization is a Mrs. J. Harmon Brown. Her name has will have popped up amongst many different organizations, those earlier organizations that we've already talked about. Originally, as I mentioned, the Ladies Relief Association will be to have soup kitchens within the year. They're going to have a home where they have basically a daycare center to take care of children whose families are going, mothers particularly, are going out to work. And they will be focusing on as I mentioned, the deserving poor. And this name, Miss J. Harmon Brown, is going to start popping up again, because there's going to be an organization that gets together to say, all of those efforts we've done before haven't been enough. The soup kitchens are not enough. The day nurseries are not enough. We have gentle women who have fallen on hard circumstances that need some help. And these women are going to turn to the leadership of Mrs. J. Harmon Brown. And in Mrs. J. Harmon Brown's parlor on Saratoga Street, eventually, they are going to set up what becomes the Women's Industrial Exchange. At this place, the women will be selling their hand-painted articles, their needlework, and their baked goods. Eventually, we're going to see this becomes so very successful that by 1880, they are going to have to move out of Mrs. J. Harmon's Brown and establish their own place, a building entirely just for the Women's Industrial Exchange. And from this, you can see in the Baltimore Sun that they're continuing their mission to help women of refinement in straitened circumstances. But by 1880, they have expanded their mission a little bit to include women of the poorer classes. And this is the idea that we need to help women. And as Senator Barbara Mikulski said in an interview I had with her a couple of months ago, this whole idea is of women helping women. By 1882, the success of this institution has gotten even larger, and they are going to incorporate with the Maryland General Assembly. One of the fabulous things that I found in a folder in a box on the floor in this room at the Women's Industrial Exchange were the original incorporation papers for the Women's Industrial Exchange. And I just love the early verbiage that they use. It's the idea of endeavoring by sympathy and practical aid. Again, women helping women. And what I think is also incredibly interesting about this document, as you can see, and I know it's probably very small, that the women were the ones who incorporated this institution. And you can see here that they did so using their first names. And any of us that do a lot of work with women's history know, and when we look at the Baltimore Sun articles about this, the women are always named by their husband's name. Mrs. M.N. Perry, Mrs. F.C. Latrobe. In this case, we can see here that the women use their first names to incorporate the institution, which I just think is phenomenal. These early women are married to, are daughters of, are sisters of, nieces, aunts of, the creme de la creme, as I mentioned, of Baltimore society. You will probably recognize many of those names. And I'm getting ahead of myself here. You can see here the very first president, it's Mrs. M.N. Perry. And again, this institution, which is also very interesting to me, is a non-denominational institution. It is made up of women from all different religions, all different backgrounds. We do see that there are a lot of Quaker members, a lot of members of the Johns Hopkins extended family are here. But there will be Catholic members, there will be Episcopalian, there will be Presbyterian, there will even be Jewish members of the Lady Board of Managers. And this entire institution will be run by the Lady Board of Managers. Many of the early supporters are names that we're going to recognize across lots of different charitable institutions in Baltimore City. Mary Elizabeth Garrett, Ellen Latrobe, the wife of Ferdinand Latrobe, the mayor. The Hopkins family, as I mentioned, will be highly represented throughout the Lady Board of Managers, including the aunt that he lived with, his first cousin that we know there's a lot of history with, as well a lot of nieces and nephews. The King family will also be represented. Bessie King, Mary Elizabeth Garrett's good friend, will be there, later known as one of our really important Baltimore suffragists that we've done a lot of research on. And what's also very interesting about these people that take up this early industrial exchange and even all the way through the industrial exchange history is that there's almost always a family connection. So we've seen the King sisters, we've seen the Carey sisters. We're going to see the Hopkins family are very much involved in the women's industrial exchange, not just amongst the ladies, but amongst its employees will become very much a family affair. Something that I found incredibly interesting, and I've not had a lot of time to get into the depths of the research on this one, is that one of the very first presidents was Leonice Josephine Stewart, or Mrs. John Stewart. And during some of my early research when I was at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, I was able to look at her scrapbook. And in her scrapbook was one of the early annual reports from the Women's Industrial Exchange. Unfortunately, this is one of the only about 5 of the annual reports that I've been able to find so far. But this one is incredibly interesting, primarily because of the notes that Mrs. Stewart writes all over it. You can see on here that she has there's a number of X's on the annual report, one of which is by her name and a couple of other women. And the little note in the middle talks about the fact that even though she is one of the original vice presidents of the institution, she and the other people with an X by her name decide to resign their leadership positions. She doesn't exactly mention in this little note why they do so, but if you look over to the left to her notes, you will see that she identifies a couple of 5 women here, and she writes the word cabal right next to them. So I'm sure there must have been some type of juicy stuff going on amongst these women if she's going to label those 5 women as a part of the cabal. Mrs. Stewart, interestingly enough, her daughter, as you can see there, and it's kind of hard to see, her daughter is the second woman there, is Helen Ridgely of Hampton Mansion fame. So there are lots of really big connections that we can see going on here with the Women's Industrial Exchange. As with all charitable institutions led by women, there was always a male advisory board. So far within the minutes, I haven't seen that the men have done too much. I think they were pretty hands-off in their advice to the women. But again, those men are also usually connected to the women on the Lady Board of Managers, and again, are very influential people from Baltimore society, including Francis White, who is pictured here, who is Johns Hopkins' nephew. By 1887, the Women's Industrial Exchange moves into its final location, which is where we are at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center are located today at 333 North Charles Street. The building itself harkens back to the early 1800s. And you can see there that it has the storefront that we are also familiar with, but it also had a boarding house and boarding rooms at the back of the building. By this time, we have a new president, Nellie Schley Fisher, of the Frederick Schleys. Her family is very influential in Frederick. And we're going to find in the paperwork and in the boxes of stuff, we found an original letter that she had written to a friend talking about the work of the Women's Industrial Exchange. I have been very lucky in this research, as David mentioned, that the Baltimore City Historical Society is all volunteer. So is the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, and so is the Memories of the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange. But I've been lucky enough to have some fantastic volunteers, including 3 interns from Notre Dame of Maryland University. And one of them took on the transcription of the letter by Mrs. Schley Fisher. And in this letter, which she transcribed, which I was incredibly impressed that the intern knew how to read cursive. She transcribed and talked to us about it was an in-depth look at the women's industrial exchange of the early 1900s, talking about it being a large enterprise, but that it was very systematized and actually everybody had a job. The Lady Board of Managers, each lady was a part of a different institution, a different committee, and those committees included things like taking care of the consigners, the apartments, renting out the apartments, running the lunchroom, the sewing department, etc. And something else that was very important to the Women's Industrial Exchange lady managers was figuring out a way to pay off the new building that they were in. The Women's Industrial Exchange was a huge undertaking, as Mrs. Schley-Fisher said. They did lots of different things. They had a consignment room, they had the lunch room / tea room, and you can go through some of the records that we've been able to find so far and see the different types of things that they sold through Baltimore. Not only were you able to pick things up at the lunchroom or the tea room, you could also get a to-go pack to get on the train and go out for your picnic excursion. Everything was for the time period, very reasonably priced, and it was all traditional Baltimore / Maryland food. When we talk about the consignment shop, the women of the Women's Industrial Exchange, the Lady Board of Managers, were very much involved in the entire process. And they did not let any food get sold. They did not let any needlecraft or any items get sold in the consignment shop that was not up to their standards. And what's fascinating as we have started going through some of the documents is that there were a set of rules that were used to make sure that all of the items that were sold were of a high quality. And they didn't outright always just say, no, we're not going to take your stuff. They're like, oh, let's find a way to help make it better. What they did recognize was that many of the women who needed help and needed to sell their items might not necessarily have always had the instruction that they needed to make such high quality things. So something that the Women's Industrial Exchange took on were classes to teach women how to make the high quality items. We found not only examples of advertisements for wood carving classes, there are also some examples of a sewing machine store donating a number of not just a number, an entire room full of the latest in sewing machines that were set up in one of the rooms above the Industrial Exchange, where the women could go learn how to use the newest sewing machines, learn the newest technology, and do the finest stitching that they could do, and then would be able to sell their items. By 1903, we're going to see that well over 600 women are at least partially supported by the items that they sell at the Women's Industrial Exchange. And 100 of them are going to make their entire living selling items and goods at the Women's Industrial Exchange. Now, even though these women may be making their full living, the Women's Industrial Exchange has to figure out a way to support themselves, because the women who are consigning to the Women's Industrial Exchange are making at anywhere from 85 to 90% of the full price of the items that are being sold. The Women's Industrial Exchange only takes 10 to 15% of the items. So the exchange has to figure out, how are we going to pay off that building? How are we going to keep the lights on? How are we going to pay for the water bill? How are we going to pay for all of these different things? And we're going to see so far that they've had a number of different inventive ways to raise funds. Some really fun things that we've discovered so far include selling books and having cooking classes. Juliet Corson, we've discovered, was quite an interesting cookbook salesperson. She actually wrote for the New York Times. The New York Times talks about the fact that she was maybe one of their very first bestsellers. And she came to Baltimore a couple of years in a row in the late 1880s or early 1880s to sell her books and to teach people how to cook on a budget. And you can see here, one of her books was Meals for the Millions. And they talk about, this is not about, eating those French 5-course meals. This is about learning how to cook on a budget. And they made some of their money fundraising, selling her books and having cooking classes. Another really cool Baltimore institution that we've learned about that helped raise funds for the Women's Industrial Exchange was the Paint and Powder Club. The Paint and Powder Club had a number of different fundraisers for the Women's Industrial Exchange, including the one mentioned here in the Baltimore Sun at the Chateau Hotel in the Green Spring Valley. This is a fascinating piece of history that we're hoping to dive a little bit deeper into as well. And something new that we just turned up this week was that there was a reception for Chiquita in 1901 at the Women's Industrial Exchange, where they sold tickets for young children to become acquainted with Chiquita, who evidently was quite the sensation at the World's Exchange in 1900 at the World's Fair in 1901, and this is really an interesting piece that we're going to be doing a little bit more in research as well. But when we talk about this institution of the Women's Industrial Exchange, almost the very first thing that anybody mentions are the waitresses. And the waitresses are what we oftentimes think of as really making the Women's Industrial Exchange so iconic. And we've been working hard, the research team, to discover or uncover or rediscover or these women. One of the more famous ones was Marguerite Schertl. Marguerite becomes probably the icon of all icons of the Women's Industrial Exchange waitresses. She is the waitress that is the centerpiece of the Sleepless in Seattle movie of the Women's Industrial Exchange moment, and she's going to work there for well over 50 years. We've uncovered about 3 different oral histories of Mrs. Schertl, including some towards the end of her career at the Women's Industrial Exchange. It's just a fascinating woman, and she talks about the perfection that she had in serving her customers and making sure that everyone was happy and doing things just the right way, hun. And she mentions in one of her last oral histories that she just didn't know what she'd do if she didn't work there. And that's when she was in her 90s. Marguerite will work there. And as I mentioned, the Industrial Exchange really is a family affair because she is going to work there with her sister, Carrie Garrity. And one of our interns had the privilege of doing an oral history with Carrie's son, who talked about the importance of the exchange both to his mother and his aunt. And we've really been able to discover a lot of the history of these women through the obituaries in the Sun. And the women really made the exchange. And the interpersonal relations they had with each other and with their customers in Baltimore are just fascinating. We're also going to see a number of other sisters that are going to be working there, including Loretta Tarbert, who is Carrie's sister, by the way, sorry. And like she says, where else in Baltimore could we have a job as great as this? This job was something that sometimes women came to and they retired and then came to the Women's Industrial Exchange and worked there for another 20 to 30 years. We have really been lucky that there is one former waitress that was called the Baby by these ladies who has been working with us as a volunteer researcher. And she's been giving us some of the stories of the women, of the waitresses and the customers. So we're really, the interns, as you can see there, are super excited to be getting her story and be telling her stories along with all of the other women. Now, the exchange was iconic because of the waitresses, but if it weren't for the food, they wouldn't have become the icons. We found several different menus from the exchange. This one is from 1961. And when we talked so far and done the various oral histories that we've done, a lot of different menu items stand out, but probably the one that stands out the most in everyone's memory is the chicken salad and the tomato aspic. And when they talk about coming into the exchange, they talk about the fact that they come because they feel like they're at home. They come because there are good old-fashioned Maryland items there. And they come because it is a value, because it is a very it was a very budget-friendly restaurant. In 1961, this platter cost $1.61, which was very economical in 1961. In today's money, that would be $10.54, which is still incredibly economical, especially with the rate of inflation as it's going today. It's this plate that so many people continue to remember, that tomato aspic and that chicken salad. And it's the people that made it. And we're looking for those recipes. And Miss Lydia Wright is one of the waitresses. And when we looked in and start looking into her story through various Baltimore Sun and News American articles, we hear her talk about how she's worked at the exchange for a long time. Again, these people work there because they feel like they are welcome. And she was most known for her chocolate syrup. And in the article, she says, I'm not sharing my recipes. So again, these are iconic foods, but we're not quite sure how to make them. There were also some men in the kitchen, including George Madden. George Madden had come to the exchange through a circuitous route. He had started his career as a cook on B&O Railroad dining cars and had gone to the Belvedere and eventually ended up working for his last 15 to 20 years at the Woman's Industrial Exchange. But the last cook that people remember is Dorothea Wilson. And she is known for her crab cakes, as you can see there on the left, the chicken salad, but also the lemon meringue pies. And what's absolutely fascinating that we heard from Lane Bosserman, the baby waitress, was that lemon meringue pie was of high demand, and that regulars would call in the morning and say, do you have lemon meringue pie today? And if they did, they would reserve their pieces of lemon meringue pie. So when people who just walked in off the street and wanted lemon meringue pie, it wasn't there anymore. Dorothea started working at the Women's Industrial Exchange when she was 16 and worked there basically through the end of the Women's Industrial Exchange as we know it. She was famous also for her chicken pot pies. That was another special that was served at the Women's Industrial Exchange. And FYI, she's still cooking. She's cooking at David and Dad's right down the street on Charles Street. And they still have chicken pot pie day in case anybody has a craving. Another fascinating, there's so many fascinating things, but a really fascinating part of the history that we've uncovered is something known as the Down Under Club. The Down Under Club was a group of men, mostly men, and I'll talk about that in a minute, who met at the lunch counter down in the basement of the exchange. These were men who mostly worked downtown and would come 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 days a week and eat lunch together. And as we hear from waitresses and members, this was not a place to talk politics. This was not a place to talk religion. This was a place to come and enjoy being from Baltimore, to talk about Baltimore things, and just to kind of relax and have a good time. As I mentioned, this was a men's club. It was served mostly by the waitress, Phyllis Sanders. She served them for most of the time that they were down at the lunch counter down at the basement. And they actually, as she started getting older and slowing down, and the Women's Industrial Exchange management wanted to put a new waitress in there, the men basically boycotted and refused to talk to the new waitress. Miss Phyllis, as they called her, ran the Down Under Club, as well as another waitress later on, Miss Margaret. But in order to be an actual full member of the club, you needed to have a membership card. We were really lucky in an earlier outreach to have discovered that there were 3 female members of the Down Under Club, and one of them, Judith Rusick, reached out to me, and we had a fabulous interview, and she allowed us a picture of her Down Under Club membership card, and you can see there that it is signed by Miss Phyllis. You were not an official member until Miss Phyllis signed off on you. And Judith was able to talk to me about the other 2 women members, and we are in touch with the one remaining surviving one, and we'll be doing an oral history with her to learn about her stories. The building also had apartments, and one of the ways I mentioned before that the Women's Industrial Exchange raised money was through renting out those apartments. Another incredible find was an original rental agreement that we found. And those apartments were rented out mostly to women in the early days. And some of the early records were see that it's called a boarding house, but we haven't gotten to go too deeply into that yet. But it is oftentimes, we're going to see so far that many of the apartments are rented out to employees of the Industrial Exchange. This rental agreement is with Ella White, the manager of the Industrial Exchange at the time, who's actually going to live there for a number of years and is going to retire there and live there through her retirement. Another huge discovery we found were the minutes of the 1970s for the Women's Industrial Board, where we have found a number of different people, but the interns were incredibly excited to find the name of a woman by the name of Christy Berglund from the 1976 minutes. They also found that there was a Berglund who was the treasurer of the exchange. And the interns did a quick Google search and realized that Christy Berglund was still alive and that she was working as an artist, both in Baltimore and in New England. And Eliza was able to interview her. And we learned a lot more about the apartments and how the exchange worked. And an even bigger find, we found that Ms. Berglund did a number of portraits of employees of the Industrial Exchange, including Miss Lydia there on the left, and who we've already mentioned about, who made the chocolate syrup. Something else that in the oral histories we find out about is the gentility of the Women's Industrial Exchange and the fact that there was always a doorman there to help women up the steps in and out of the building to carry their packages. Clifford Tongue there on the right was one of the doormen in the mid-1970s. Mrs. Orphan, as painted by Miss Berglund on the left, was the bookkeeper for the exchange. And then Miss Willie on the right is really a Women's Industrial Exchange legend that we'll talk about just a little bit more. But we're really lucky that Miss Berglund has allowed us to be sharing these portraits with everyone. And speaking of Miss Willie, or Wilhelmina Godwin, that we have uncovered lots of famous guests that have been at the Women's Industrial Exchange. And it was one of the fun things that we found out was that Miss Willie took it upon herself to invite people to come to the exchange. And one of the things she did was that she would research who was coming to the local theaters, and she would send them notes and invite them to the exchange. And then they would come and visit. And some of you may remember when you came to eat lunch or came to visit the Women's Industrial Exchange, you would sign in a book. And Miss Willie kept this book, and we found a number of the books. And as she kept those books, she would often make comments on the days and when people came. One of the most famous guests was Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn came to the Industrial Exchange a number of different times, and we found her signature in at least 2 of the books. She comes and she talks about buying things. She talks about having lunch. Hepburn came not only because she was performing at the various theaters, but because she had a familial connection to Baltimore. Her aunt, Edith Houghton Hooker, was a Johns Hopkins Medical School graduate and one of the most prominent Baltimore suffragists of all. So she would often come to visit family as well. And she came a number of different times, and tucked away in a box, I found a thank you note from her, thanking for the exchange for the cookie hearts. She's just one of the many that we've uncovered so far. but one of the fun ones, and probably one of the most iconic. I keep using that word a lot, but it really fits everything that we're talking about here. Um, Other visitors was Senator Barbara Mikulski. And in our oral history with Senator Mikulski, she talked about how she used to lunch at the Women's Industrial Exchange when she worked for Catholic Charities. But then once she becomes senator, we see that she will be a huge advocate for the Women's Industrial Exchange. And by the early 2000s, we're going to see that the Industrial Exchange needs a lot of work. It needs a lot of renovation. And she spearheaded the effort to get federal grants to help renovate the building. And she loves talking about the exchange and about how it is this wonderful Baltimore institution where we see that women are helping women. The consignment shop was a huge part of that. We haven't gotten too deeply into the history of the consignment shop. This is the history that is much more hidden than any of the history that we've uncovered so far, primarily, especially because in the beginning years, the women were consigning their items and didn't want anyone to know what they were doing. What is fascinating about this history is that the Industrial Exchange, tea room, and the consignment shop were managed by women. And both of these opportunities provided women with an opportunity to learn retail skills that they would not be able to have anywhere else, because even though women would work in the various department stores, there was not opportunity for women to manage in the department stores. So the Women's Industrial Exchange was able to provide that type of training for women as well. And what I think is so fun, and what we hear talked about a lot in all of the different interviews so far, is this idea that the Women's Industrial Exchange was just so very old-fashioned, so very genteel, so very Baltimore. And I think not much exemplifies that except for these two pictures. On the left, you can see this is the exchange in 1917, and then in 1971, it doesn't look that different. And when, I'm not going to say if, when you visit the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, this is where our location is, you're going to see it's not that different today. There's still a lot of research to be done. As I mentioned, and we all know, Baltimore's history is complicated, and the Women's Industrial Exchange was a segregated institution. And we have uncovered, thanks to Baltimore National Heritage Area, at least at the beginning, we know that there was a colored women's exchange. So we do have some members that will be doing some research to discover who those people were, where they were, and what happened, as well as to go deeper into the Women's Industrial Exchange to see that more complicated history as well. So I'm here today, not really just to share the fun things, but also to ask for help. We want to know if you have stories to share. Do you have artifacts? We don't want to keep your artifacts. We just want pictures, but we want to make sure that we can have as complete a history of the Women's Industrial Exchange as possible. We're also looking for help, research help. So if you are out there and would love to start researching, whether it be biographies of the women and men who worked here or managed here or attend anything, we would love to have your help. And I would be remiss if I did not thank the many people that have been helping us with this research, including my interns from the Notre Dame of Maryland University. And we also have what we like to call these volunteer or citizen researchers who've been doing some hard and fabulous work for us as well. So here is my email. I would love, love, love to hear from you, whether it's just to share a little story or something even bigger. But thank you so much. We hope to see you at the Women's Industrial Exchange, where we are at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. We are having an open house on June 3rd, and we have our front window is full of Women's Industrial Exchange artifacts and history, and we will be celebrating Edith Houghton Hooker, the aunt of Katharine Hepburn and Baltimore's famous suffragist. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenkrans. So I know we had a couple of comments and questions that came through in the chat while you were talking, and perhaps you may have addressed some of these a little bit, but we can go through. And of course, if you are the person that made the comment or question and want to clarify or add on, feel free to unmute yourself. But the first question from Stephen: are they using their own names because it's legally required by the state to incorporate?
Stephen, that's a really good question. And that's something that I've been struggling with. And I don't know that answer. Maybe somebody out there does that could help us with that. I think I saw Dr. Pappenfuss come in, so he might know that answer. But we can research that and get back to you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking, from my law school days, it might mean, they couldn't have a male proxy in order to incorporate.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and so like by virtue of the structure, they had to have used their own names. They had to, be present.
Yeah. And that's probably the case. It was just striking to me through all the history that we've been doing. There's never their first names. And it was actually very helpful because it's when doing research into women's history, that's one of the big struggles is you see Mrs. So-and-so, and then you've got to figure out who was Mrs. So-and-so. So being able to find those incorporation documents was a big boon.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah. Are there still apartments on the upper floors? Are they rented? Who is the landlord?
Yeah. So when the Women's Industrial Exchange officially closed in 2001, it was taken over by Marion House, which is a nonprofit organization that is working to help women and to help them transition into they get industrial skills and transition from challenging situations. So the Women's Industrial Building is their second building, and they're the landlords. And we rent from them, and the apartments upstairs are transitional housing for some of their clients.
Great, carrying on that tradition as you
Yeah.
as you alluded to. And just had a few comments, and hopefully these are some of the folks that will scan that QR code or email you. But a mention of the iconic waitresses uniforms with the huge bows in the back. And I don't remember who this is in reference to, but that somebody does a show on WYPR still. So I don't know if you caught that earlier.
Yeah. So the uniforms, when going through the boxes and boxes of stuff, one of the things that I really wanted to find was a uniform, and we didn't. But one day we were able to get into another room at the exchange and found another cache of items, and we found the blue uniform. And there was lots of screaming that day because we found the uniform. What we've not been able to find are the bows or the aprons. So we're still out there looking for those. Somebody asked me on Saturday at the Pratt, what is your big wish list item you want to find? I want to find the bow and the apron. Jaywin Russick, Judith Russick that's exactly who she is, the woman who was a member of the Down Under Club. She is the theater critic. At the time, she was the theater critic for The Sun, which is why she was lunching at the Women's Industrial Exchange. And then it's a funny story. She talks about how she used to lunch there because it's right down the street from the Baltimore Sun, or was right down the street from the Baltimore Sun offices. And she heard the men talking about one of her articles. And she interrupted them and said, hey, do you guys know that I wrote that article? And from then on, she kind of became a member of their club and eventually a card carrying member of that club. But yeah, now she's on YPR.
Very cool.
We have a couple of hands going up here, David.
Oh, perfect. Brian, if you'd like to unmute yourself, Brian Morrison, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Amy, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for your work. It's really exciting and interesting research. You're doing some really good work as usual.
Thank you.
You know where my question is going. So as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking of the intersectionality between race and gender, Black women, Black men, and towards the end, I see there's a Black woman who's a cook and a Black man who cooks there, and I'm just, you say there are more questions to come, and some of the questions I have are particularly about the Black women's or the colored women's industrial exchange. Where was that? Who are the people involved? Who are the families, the prominent African-American Baltimore families that were involved, and what kind of work were they doing? Was it similar? And as far as the people who came into the women's industrial exchange, what was their policy on race? I know it was Jim Crow and segregation, and what were the thoughts of these women? What were their ideas about all of this? Those are my questions. Those are the queries for me.
Yeah, and those are our questions as well. We've got a lot, and there's some things that I've been uncovering that are not particularly kind to the Lady Board of Managers. I have not been able to uncover exactly when the industrial exchange integrated. I'm looking to see if that was done because everything else was due to law. I have not been able to uncover when we have the first African-American employees, meaning waitresses, right? We had cooks, but when did we have waitresses? There are a couple instances that I found in the 1976 minutes of some complaints from African-American employees about their treatment and about whether they have been unfairly fired. And there is one mention that the next waitress that we have to hire has got to be Black. So it's going to be uncomfortable, obviously, but we've got to figure out what it is. And I need some more help doing some research. As far as the Colored Women's Industrial Exchange, I haven't gone too deep into that except for to do a preliminary search in the Afro. What I uncovered so far, and I don't have the time, and we have grant money from Baltimore National Heritage Area that I've got to finish this with first. But it looks, just based on the advertisements from the Afro, that the Colored Women's Industrial Exchange seem to be more social service-like. It talks about jobs, helping with job searches and things like that. So I don't know if there was a tea room or not, but I'm looking to create a team of people who will help me do that research. So in your spare time, Brian, I'd like to have you on board.
Spare time, okay.
Good to see you.
Same.
I haven't looked in the green book yet, Stephen. No, that's on the list. We have another hand.
Yes, Terry, if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself, you're welcome to ask your question.
Well,
Terry
first of all,
Dexter.
thank you so much for this presentation. Very, very interesting. And I used to work at the Walters Art Museum, and in like 69, I think, was my first venture to the Women's Industrial Exchange. And of course, a lot of people from the Walters would go there for lunch. And we did see the waitresses with the big bows on the back and had the chicken salad with the tomato aspic, and also the deviled eggs. That was the other thing that was, and the ice cream with the chocolate sauce. Always had that. But it also was the best place to go in town for baby gifts, because every item in the shop was individualized. I mean, it was something, and the sock monkeys that would be sold at the exchange, everybody wanted those, and they would run out right away. And so I don't know if you have any of those in your pile of artifacts or anything, but so it was thank you so much for this, because when you're living the experience, you don't realize what's behind all of it. And so it's nice to think back and put all the history in context.
Thanks. So speaking of baby gifts, evidently it was one of the best places to buy baby layettes with the smocked dresses and christening gowns. There's urban legend out there that some families have had the same christening gown in their family for generations, that they bought at the Women's Industrial Exchange. We'd love to talk to whoever has those and get pictures. So just putting that out there. But yes, they talk about baby gifts as well. One of the things that Judith Russick talked about was every time a friend had a baby, she went there and got a specific item. And all of her friends got the same item from her. So yeah, for sure.
And the baby dresses with all the smocking.
Yeah.
That was the other thing that it was very beautiful work.
Yeah. Stuff we don't see anymore.
Right.
I think Mike's up there with a hand.
Let's
Yeah.
hear it, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. First, 3 cheers for uncomfortable research. I mean, that's the best kind.
Yes.
I'm interested in denominational aspects of the folks that were involved. It's not significant that you had various Protestant denominations involved, but the membership of Catholic and Jewish women is interesting because
Yes.
most organizations didn't operate that way.
Yes. Yes, you're right, which I found that significant as well, but it's not something that we've gone too deeply into right now. Right now, we're at surface level of identifying who the people are.
Mhm.
But yeah, we're going to be checking out who those people are. And again, those families are, those influential families in Baltimore.
Yeah, thank you.
So McSherry is an important Catholic name that some of us might recognize.
Mhm.
So if I don't see any others, I think I can sneak one of my various questions in.
Okay.
So you mentioned oral histories, and I understand that there's an active oral history project with this as well. Were you able to locate, or interns able to locate oral histories that were collected, either in the 70s or earlier to support that, or were they mostly, smaller accounts from the Sun or things like that?
So there was a documentary that was created called Not a Lady Among Us in the early 2000s, which has interviews with a number of different people. And we have the finished documentary, and we have put out feelers to the people who wrote and filmed that to see if we can get their original transcripts. There's also a couple of projects where there's a book called Hey Lady, which is a book about waitresses that has an oral history about Marguerite, which is phenomenal. And the actual oral history is up in Boston at one of the university libraries. But a lot of the other stuff we found just through culling the Baltimore Sun and the News American to get interviews with them.
All right. Amy, would you mind putting up would you mind putting up your final slide again, just so folks on the way out might grab your contact if they want to follow up?
Sure.
So thank you so much again to Dr. Amy Rosenkrans for a very illuminating talk this evening, continuing our series. Well, let's see if we got a... So we will be finishing out our series next month on, make sure I give the right date, always that third Thursday, June 15th, day after Flag Day, day after my birthday. And we will be hearing then from Evans Paul on the Stop the Road, which is related to the history and ongoing legacy of the Highway to Nowhere. So should be a really excellent talk to finish us off this season and have another great example of local history. But thank you again to you all for joining us, to my fellow board members, and we'll hope to hear in the future how this research progresses, and hopefully many of us can be a part of it.
Thanks. Hopefully we'll be back next year.
All right.
Thanks, guys.